They didn't become monsters. They invited monsters in the frostbitten forests of 9th century Scandinavia, where the gods had no mercy and men had no limits. There emerged a warrior cult so feared, so unnatural, that even death recoiled from them. These were not ordinary Vikings. They were Ulfhednar, the wolf-coated ones, and berserkers, the bare-chested beasts, men who offered their souls to the hunger of ancient spirits in exchange for inhuman power. What they became was neither man nor beast, but something far older, far darker. This is not myth. This is war twisted by possession, ritual warfare, supernatural transformation. And for those who stood in their path, there was no heaven to pray to, only howling. Tonight, we follow their blood-soaked trail through forgotten valleys, pagan rites, and whispered warnings to uncover the terrifying truth about the Viking shapeshifters history tried to erase. This is the story of the Ulfhednar, some warriors trained to kill. Eric trained to become something that could never die. In the depths of Scandinavia's forgotten woods, where sunlight died early and screams traveled far, a young man named Eric knelt naked in a circle of standing stones that predated every known empire. Around him, the air crackled with a silence that felt intentional, like the world itself was holding its breath. Before him, sprawled across the frostbitten earth, was the body of a massive gray wolf, its throat freshly torn open, steam still rising from its open chest. The blade used to kill it, bronze, old as memory, had been passed down through 13 generations. Each drop of blood it drank remembered in ritual, but this was no hunt. This was a summoning. Eric had followed the beast for 7 nights, guided not by tracks, but by dreams sent by the vulva, the death-eyed witch woman who spoke in riddles and remembered things that had never happened. The final night, the wolf had stopped running. It had turned, stared at him across the snow, and knelt, as if it knew. Now, Eric leaned over the corpse, lips trembling as he brought them to the muzzle. The blood was warm, metallic, but beneath the iron was something older, something wild. It tasted like fire, frost, and memories that weren't his. The blood wasn't the goal. It was the door. When Eric stripped the pelt from the wolf's body and draped it over his bare shoulders, the forest shuddered. The moment fur touched skin, he felt it, a second presence, sharp and cold, like a claw sliding between his thoughts. It did not speak in words. It showed him things. Snow racing under paws, the smell of terror on the wind, a heartbeat slowing in prey that knew it would not escape. "Let us in," the voice said, not aloud, but inside, like a whisper, in his blood. At first, Eric resisted. He tried to hold on to the last scraps of his name, his past, his humanity, but the wolf was patient. It offered something no man could resist, freedom from fear, from weakness, from limits. Not just strength, but permission to become what men were never meant to be. And as the stars spun overhead and the torchlight flickered against the stones, Eric dropped to his knees and howled. The sound that ripped from his throat did not belong to any man or any animal. It was the cry of something new. And that was the night the wind began to carry legends of a name whispered only in terror. Eric the Ravener. But what no one knew is that he wasn't the first Ulfhednar. He was the first to succeed. And the price of that success is what would damn them all. They say Bjorn couldn't feel pain, but the truth is far worse. He missed it. Word of Eric's transformation spread like wildfire through the northern clans. Young warriors, disillusioned with conquest, bored by blood, began whispering about a path beyond mortality, beyond fear. Among them was Bjorn the Bone Crusher, a man whose name had already passed into myth. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, his arms thick as tree trunks, his voice low and cracked like winter ice. For years, he had wandered from battlefield to battlefield, breaking men like sticks, hunting stronger enemies who never came. Victories brought him no joy. Death had become a chore. He didn't crave conquest. He craved feeling again. When he heard about Eric, he didn't hesitate. No questions, no prayers. He entered the forest barefoot, carrying nothing but a blood-stained axe and the gnawing ache of a man who had grown numb to the world. The vulva was waiting. She gave him no directions, only a name, Ironback. Ironback was a bear, but not just any bear. Hunters claimed it stood taller than a horse, with claws like scythes and eyes that seemed almost aware. Its pelt was a map of old scars. They said it had killed entire warbands. And yet, Bjorn smiled when he heard its name. Finally, he muttered, something that might break me. The battle began just after dusk and lasted until dawn. Trees fell, blood soaked into snow. Roars shook the mountains. Witnesses from far-off villages would later speak of a night when the sky turned red and the wind howled like gods in mourning. When it ended, Bjorn stood alone, his chest ripped open, his leg shattered, but smiling. At his feet lay Ironback's body, twisted and silent. Then came the ritual. Bjorn didn't just wear the bear's skin. He devoured its heart raw, eyes wild with something primal and wrong. As the blood poured down his chin, his veins pulsed with rage incarnate. But unlike Eric's cunning wolf spirit, what entered Bjorn was pure wrath, a presence that knew nothing but collision, domination, annihilation. It didn't whisper. It roared. From that night on, Bjorn became something unstoppable. When the bear took over, he moved like an avalanche in human form. Blades shattered against his skin. Arrows snapped in his flesh. Pain became fuel. Wounds made him stronger. His enemies didn't scream. They gurgled. But the price was steep. Between battles, he would vanish for days, returning with eyes sunken and lips crusted in dried blood. He spoke of dreams where he hunted men like deer, where his hands were paws, and his thoughts were not his own. He stopped laughing. Then he stopped speaking. Then he stopped sleeping altogether. And when he stared into the fire, his packmates began to wonder. Was Bjorn still inside that body? Or had the bear finally taken over? He had conquered death, but he could no longer remember why. Not everyone survived the ritual. Some were devoured by it. As Eric and Bjorn grew into legend, others came seeking the same power, not for glory, not even for strength, but for escape, from grief, from shame, from the crushing weight of their own minds. The forest became a place of whispers, a dark sanctuary where men abandoned names and bled for something older than gods. But what the stories never told was what it took to earn the beast. The initiation was not a rite of passage. It was a demolition. New recruits were stripped of everything: clothes, weapons, names, memories. They were driven deep into the frozen wild with no fire, no food, and only a single rule: survive. But do not kill like a man. Kill with your hands. Eat without fire. Sleep without walls. Speak no human words. For those weeks, they howled until their throats tore, crawling on all fours through the black pines, waiting for the spirit to come. And if it didn't, they were never seen again. But for those who were chosen, the second phase began. They were brought before the pack, still feral, still unsure whether they had become something else or simply broken beyond repair. Then came the blood, not drunk, inhaled, worn, breathed in, blood from sacred kills, passed down through skull cups and smeared onto the face. The transformation did not happen all at once. It crept in slowly, a scratching at the back of the mind, the sense that you weren't alone in your own head, that something was watching, waiting to take the reins. Many failed. Some lost control and turned rabid, attacking trees, shadows, their own flesh. They were put down by their brothers without hesitation. Others rejected the possession entirely, curling into silence, refusing food, dying with human tears on their cheeks. But those who passed, they emerged half human, half hunger. They remembered how to hold an axe, but forgot why peace mattered. Their minds flickered between languages, growls, snarls, forgotten dialects whispered by the wind. They hunted at night, not for meat, but for movement, for the thrill of stalking something that didn't yet know it was prey. And worst of all, they began to see people differently, not as enemies, as toys, as offerings, as the soft things they were born to chase. This was not transformation. This was infection. And once the spirit slipped inside, it never left. The monks believed they were protected by God. But even God cannot hear you scream when your soul is being devoured. The monastery at Lindisfarne was a place of silence and sanctuary, built on stone and prayer, surrounded by the shifting tides that made it both fortress and tomb. The Christian scribes who lived there had grown used to the occasional rumors of Viking raiders. But in 851 CE, what came through the fog was no war band. There were no drums, no horns, no burning sails, just silence, and black ships that glided across the morning tide like shadows pulled from the abyss. The first to see them was a novice tending the herb garden. He didn't even have time to scream before a figure stepped ashore. Tall, cloaked in stitched fur, eyes gleaming with an amber light that reflected no sun. The attack began with a sound no man could explain. Not a horn, not a cry, but a howl, so deep and ancient that it shook dust from the rafters of the scriptorium and made grown men wet themselves from pure, unfiltered fear. Brother Thomas, a devout scholar known for his steady hand and calm demeanor, dropped his quill mid-letter. The ink smeared, the parchment curled. The world outside the monastery's thick stone walls no longer obeyed the rules of God or man. He thought it might be another raid, tragic but survivable. But then the screaming began, not the kind that comes from pain, but from recognition, like the body knew it was about to be hunted, and the mind hadn't caught up. The chapel doors burst inward in a storm of wood and fire. Through the smoke came Eric the Ravener, though no one would have called him that now. His face had stretched into something lupine, his arms longer, thicker, bent at impossible angles. The wolfskin no longer hung on him. It had become part of him, grafted into the flesh like some ancient parasite fused to its host. His eyes glowed like moonlit ice, and when he opened his mouth, it was not to speak, but to scream. The sound wasn't heard, it was felt. It vibrated the bones, reached through the stone, and crawled into the marrow like frostbite from the inside out. Brother Thomas tried to flee. He never reached the altar. Eric crossed the space like wind through a forest, limbs moving in a blur of muscle and nightmare geometry. His claws raked across Thomas's chest, but the real damage came when skin touched skin, because then the possession began. Thomas saw through Eric's eyes, the scent of fear, the joy of the hunt, the orgasmic release of control. It was intoxicating. For one brief, terrible second, he understood, and he almost didn't want it to stop. The massacre that followed wasn't a raid. It was a purification. The monks weren't robbed. They were unmade. They died choking on air that had turned sour with ancestral malice. The survivors would describe men who were not men, warriors who walked like beasts and spoke in howls and hisses, whose shadows moved before them, and whose teeth were far too many for a human jaw. The church didn't believe the first reports, but the consistency was undeniable. Different witnesses, different voices, all describing the same horror. Vikings possessed by spirits older than time, cloaked in blood and howling at stone crucifixes. Lindisfarne fell in less than an hour, but its silence still echoes through Christian memory like a wound that never healed. The massacre became legend. But what most forgot was the feeling. That split second when the scream reached your soul and whispered, "You were never prey before, but now you run." They were summoned as honored guests, but the meat was poisoned and the walls were closing in. By 855 CE, the Ulfednar were no longer legend whispered around fires. They were a spreading plague, a dangerous reality that kings could no longer ignore. Their names stirred both awe and dread. Their howls were heard in dreams long after the battlefield had fallen silent. So when Harald Fairhair, the rising king determined to unite Norway's fractured tribes under one rule, sent messengers to the Ulfar, inviting them to a feast in their honor, many believed it was a sign, a recognition of strength, a merging of old power with new leadership. Eric the Ravener, Bjorn the Bone Crusher, and several dozen of their most fearsome warriors arrived at the Hall of Avildness beneath skies slick with iron-colored clouds. They found bonfires already roaring, barrels of mead overflowing, and long tables groaning under the weight of roasted meat. It looked like celebration, but something in the air was off. The smell beneath the food was wrong. The drums were too slow, the laughter too brittle. And the servants, though trained to smile, avoided eye contact like prey that knows the forest has gone silent. It was Sven Wolfi who noticed it first. A veteran of 15 battles, Sven was never the most powerful of the pack, but his wolf spirit was alert, sharp in the unseen ways that saved lives before steel ever clashed. As he moved through the crowd, he felt it, the wrongness, the placement of guards behind pillars, the subtle shift in body language when the Ulfar entered, the way conversations died when claws tapped wooden floors. His spirit growled within, and then Harald stood. The king raised a golden horn and welcomed his guests, praising their strength, their savagery, their devotion to the old gods. But beneath the flattery lay the knife. "Yet some among us," Harald said with a voice wrapped in silk and steel, "have gone too far. Men who once fought for glory now fight only for blood. Creatures who no longer see friend or foe when the frenzy takes them. Such warriors," he smiled thinly, "are useful in war, but dangerous in peace." The moment steel was drawn, the illusion shattered. Guards disguised as revelers lunged from the shadows, blades aimed for hearts and throats, but they were too late, because the moment danger touched the room, the beast spirits awoke, and they were starving. Eric's transformation had grown over the years. What once required ritual and invocation now happened instinctively, like a muscle flexing in rage. His spine cracked outward as he fell to all fours, mouth widening into something that could no longer form human speech. The man was gone. What rose was a predator older than fire. His howl shattered glass and sent trained soldiers into paralysis, their minds torn between fight and flee, but neither could save them. Eric moved with impossible speed, closing the gap between himself and the first attacker in less than a breath. One moment the guard raised his blade, the next his arms were ripped clean from his torso, blood painting the rafters in streaks of red that reached the ceiling beams. Bjorn's change was slower, but more terrifying. His body seemed to swell with every heartbeat, skin stretching as muscle grew, bones thickening, joints snapping and reforming until he towered over the battlefield like a demigod sculpted from raw violence. Blades bit into his flesh but did nothing. Pain was a forgotten language. Each wound made him stronger, the rage feeding itself until he became a living catastrophe. He grabbed one attacker by the head and crushed it between his hands like fruit, roaring in a voice that wasn't his, but something that had long since devoured the man he used to be. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughterhouse without purpose or restraint. The feast hall became a tomb of broken bodies and unanswered screams. Walls were clawed red, tables overturned and shattered beneath the weight of unnatural fury. Warriors who had survived countless wars died screaming, not from wounds, but from fear. They had prepared to fight men. They were not prepared to fight myths made flesh. When it was over, only a handful remained. The fire had dimmed. The air was thick with copper and silence. Harold had survived only by locking himself in a cellar beneath the great hall, emerging hours later into a world that smelled of death and sounded like the aftermath of a god's nightmare. Eric stood among the wreckage, his fur matted with blood, his eyes no longer human. For a moment, he looked around as if trying to remember what this place had once been. A hall of kings? A stage for glory? A trap? It didn't matter now. His gaze lingered not on the living, but on the shapes burned into the walls, shadows of beasts that should never have been. Something had broken that night. Not bones, not walls, but the line between man and monster, and no one, not Harold, not the gods, not even the spirits themselves, would ever unmake it again. That night, they were no longer warriors possessed by beasts. They were beasts who remembered just enough humanity to aim. The body heals. The mind does not. By the winter of 860 CE, the Ulfednar had won every battle, slaughtered every rival, defied every king. But their greatest enemy was not the sword or the spear, it was the silence between battles. For it was there, in the long nights after the last scream faded, that the beast spirits began to feed on what was left of their human minds. Magnus Crossbane had once been one of their brightest, a raven-bonded warrior, chosen for his speed, his battlefield awareness, and the uncanny way he could sense death before it arrived. The raven was not rage like Bjorn's bear, nor hunger like Eric's wolf. It was knowing. It whispered secrets. It watched from above, and for a time, it made him untouchable. But then, it never stopped watching. He began to see too much, too clearly. The living blurred into shadows. The dead became vivid, colorful, familiar. Magnus could walk through a village and tell you who would die next, not by prophecy, but by scent, by aura, by whispers only he could hear. He spent hours wandering graveyards, talking to things that weren't there. He stopped blinking. He stopped sleeping. He claimed the raven no longer perched beside him but inside him, feeding him voices that would not be silenced. Some were beautiful, most were not. During one raid, something cracked. As he stepped through the flames of a burning village, Magnus stopped. Not for prayer, not for mercy, but because he saw them, the ghosts. The souls of the men, women, and children he had killed rose from their broken bodies like smoke, and they followed him. Dozens of them, whispering, begging, accusing. They weren't metaphor. They weren't madness. They were real, and only he could see them. By the time the sun rose, Magnus was found curled in a heap, rocking back and forth, his lips moving in silent conversation with the dead. He never lifted a weapon again. But Magnus was not alone. Thorvald Bearkiller had been a champion of the cult for over 15 years, known for tearing through warbands like wildfire. He once killed 4 men with his bare hands before the first one hit the ground. But as the bear spirit grew stronger, Thorvald's grip on himself loosened. At first, the changes came in dreams, waking up in the woods, blood on his teeth, memories gone. Then, entire days disappeared. He would vanish into the snow and return days later naked, shivering, with dried meat clenched in his jaw and no idea whose it was. Language left him next. His voice, once deep and loud, was reduced to grunts and snarls. He began to crawl, even when he could walk. Fire terrified him. Mirrors enraged him. And when his brothers looked into his eyes, they no longer saw the man they had trained beside. They saw something older, something hungry. The others tried to help, but how do you speak to a man who no longer knows he was ever human? They started calling him the Hollowed, not out of cruelty, but mourning. Thorvald had not died. He had been replaced. And then there was Eric, the first, the leader, the one whose howl had opened the floodgates of legend. By 867, Eric had shared his mind with the wolf for longer than any other, and the consequences were unraveling faster than he could hold them together. He no longer remembered his family's names. He spoke of battles from centuries past with vivid detail, describing rituals, warriors, victories that predated his birth by generations. At times, he would answer to names no one recognized. He would say, "I am Ulfr Kettle. I am the one who tore open the sky at Skagafjord." And no one knew if it was metaphor or memory. During one winter solstice, Eric stood before his pack, eyes blank, arms outstretched. He began to recite verses in a tongue even the vulva didn't understand. His voice dropped an octave. His shadow shifted against the firelight in unnatural ways. And when it ended, the silence was so complete that even the wind dared not move. The shaman warned that Eric was approaching a final threshold, a point beyond which he would no longer be man inhabited by spirit, but spirit wearing the corpse of a man. Once that line was crossed, there would be no Eric to bring back, only the wolf, and not just a wolf. The wolf, the one who remembered every host, every kill, every blood-soaked moon since the first pact was made in the time before fire. The Ulfhednar had not been blessed. They had been borrowed, and the interest was coming due. They had unlocked the door between man and monster, and each time they passed through it, the hinges loosened, the bones shifted, the soul cracked, and one day soon, they would step through and find that there was no way back, not because they couldn't return, but because they had forgotten why they ever wanted to. The last true Ulfhednar wasn't killed. He was documented. In the waning years of the 9th century, long after the howls had faded and the rivers had run clean again, the cult of the beast warriors began to vanish, not in battle, but in silence. They didn't die. They disappeared. Into the forests, into the frost, into themselves. The name Ulfhednar became myth again, a warning whispered to children who didn't understand it had once been real. But not everyone forgot. In the year 867 CE, a man named Father Aldrich, a Frankish monk, scholar of the strange, and veteran of exorcisms the Vatican refused to acknowledge, received a letter sealed in blood wax. It spoke of a surviving pack deep within the woods of Denmark. Not raiders, not men, something else. Something that preyed in howls and fed in circles of bone. Aldrich did not dismiss it. He had seen too much. He gathered 2 fellow clergy and a dozen warriors sworn to silence and rode out not to destroy, but to observe. What they found was not a village. It was a dead zone. The forest bent away from it. No birds, no insects, not even rot. The trees seemed to recoil from what lived at the center. The camp was built from bones, antler, femur, jaw, stacked into huts like dens, smeared in ash and blood. The Ulfar moved within the clearing like shadows, silent, lean, more animal than man. They no longer spoke in words but in growls, nods, stares. They did not light fires. They ate raw. They slept in piles, as if warmth came not from flame but from pack memory. One of the soldiers whispered, "They're not pretending to be animals. They've forgotten they were ever men." Aldrich made notes, drew sketches, recorded symbols carved into stone and bark. Some predated the Viking Age by centuries. And then, on the 3rd night, he saw the ritual. The moon rose red. The fire, built from human ribs stacked like a tower, crackled without flame, smoke curling in shapes that writhed as if alive. The remaining Ulfar, no more than 13, gathered around the fire in a circle, claws painted with blood, their mouths moving in chants that scraped the air like bone on stone. their bodies twisted not all at once, but in pieces. Arms snapped, skin split, fur erupted in patches. Some fell to the ground, spasming as the transformation overtook them in uneven pulses. These were not clean metamorphoses. These were violations of biology, of law, of design. Faces elongated into snarling muzzles, but teeth grew too fast, spilling from jaws before mouths could hold them. Legs bent the wrong way. Eyes rolled white as the beast inside pushed outward, screaming its rebirth through flesh that had carried too many hosts before. Aldrich fled. The others did not. He heard the sounds, wet, sharp, muffled, and ran until his lungs tore. Only he survived to return. His report, locked within the deepest vaults of the Vatican's forbidden archive, was never meant to be read by the public. In it, he described not a warrior cult, but a permanent rupture in the human spirit, creatures that remembered war, death, starvation, and submission, not through story, but through cellular memory. They had become vessels of ancestral rage, primal dominance, and spiritual addiction. They were not just possessed, they were habitats. The Ulfednar were outlawed officially in 1015 CE by the Althing of Iceland, the last public record of their existence. But outlawing a legend does not erase its blood, because the blood remembers. In the centuries that followed, whispers continued, stories of men who howled in their sleep, children born with golden eyes, soldiers on the battlefield who could not die and could not be calmed, missing pages from medical reports, sealed criminal files, remote families with rage in the bloodline and strange, ancient symbols carved into their barns. The rituals survive, not openly, but in fragments, drawings, mutterings, books bound in hide and buried in salt. There are those who still call to the old spirits, hoping for strength, for freedom, for transformation. But they never ask the right question. They never ask what happens after the spirit stops sharing. Modern science has tried to explain the berserker phenomenon, hallucinogenic mushrooms, PTSD, genetic psychosis, but no theory explains the consistency of the accounts, the unnatural speed, the eyes that glowed. The claws that left wounds no blade could mimic. No theory explains why survivors of these encounters describe feeling watched long after the beast left, as if some part of them was taken and never given back. Some doors do not open, they reopen, and once opened, they do not close. The Ulfednar were not monsters. They were men who asked the oldest question, what if I let it in? What if I surrendered? What if I stopped resisting the part of me that still remembers the thrill of the hunt? The snap of bone, the warmth of blood on the tongue, the freedom of forgetting what it means to be human. And the answer is what haunts us still, because the beast never leaves. It just waits. You've never worn a wolf's pelt, but your blood might remember what it felt like. You, watching this, what do you think lives in your DNA? Just your hair color, your tolerance for dairy, or something older? Darker? What if rage wasn't random? What if your worst impulses, the snap, the blackout, the craving for control, aren't flaws, but echoes? Because the Ulfednar didn't just vanish. They sank into bloodlines, into surnames you don't say out loud, into villages that changed names 3 times, into your grandfather's eyes when he got too quiet during thunderstorms. The rituals were buried, the teeth pulled, but the hunger never left. Modern science calls it genetic memory, epigenetics, intergenerational trauma. But deep down, your body doesn't need a term for it. It just knows. That tingling in your spine, the way your heart races when the moon is full, that moment when you're alone and the woods feel like they're watching you back, that's not paranoia. That's recognition. So the next time you feel something stir behind your ribcage when you're cornered or afraid, ask yourself a simple question. What if the thing you fear isn't coming for you? What if it's coming from you?